Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the history of the Philippines before Magellan, 3000 BCE to 1521 CE by Knowledgia. As always, I will include a link to the original content in the description down below. If you like what you see here, please head over to Knowledgia and let them know that we appreciate the work they've been doing. So they've done a lot of videos on the history of the Philippines. This one would be covering the earliest period, so I thought I would take a look at this one first. I hope to go through a couple more of their videos on the Philippines at some point in the future. And I do want to get at least one video at some point on the Philippine-American War, because I think that's one of those wars in American history that does not get talked about nearly enough in this country. And that's for a good reason. It's not a war our government or people want to talk about, because it kind of puts us in a dark light, just to be completely frank. I want to get to that at some point, but I kind of wanted to build up to it. I've always been fascinated by Philippine history, culture. My very first girlfriend was a Filipina. I used to spend a lot of time with the Philippine community here in my hometown. I used to go to their annual Philippine New Year parties, great parties. If you ever get a chance, great fun. I love the cuisine. I've always had nothing but wonderful experiences with the Philippine people. I love their music, their culture, and all of that. I've got a Filipina goddaughter, and I helped raise a little Philippine girl from the time she was born pretty much until she was in her early teens. So this is a country and a culture that was a fairly significant part of my early young adulthood. I've always wanted to visit the country, and I've always wanted to learn more about their history. I've done some reading over the years, but it's really hard to find good material on the Philippines around here, and even on YouTube, which is a pity, because it's really a fascinating country with fascinating history. So let's go ahead and watch this, and let's see what Knowledgia has to tell us about this country.
The Philippines is an archipelago in the Pacific Ocean, consisting of over 7,000 islands.
Right, 7,600 or so.
It sits on a subduction zone in the Ring of Fire, the geologic belt that surrounds the Pacific, and is the source of a great deal of the seismic activity experienced from Japan to Alaska to California.
Okay, that's true, but a little misleading, because we're not clear if he's talking about the Ring of Fire or about the Pacific Plate. So let's talk a little bit about that, because it's a fascinating topic. So what we're talking about with the Ring of Fire is we have various parts of the world are set upon plates, which are just basically, think of an eggshell that's been cracked. These plates move around. They're not static. When I was a geology student, they didn't really know for sure what was causing the plates to move. There were various theories. Current in the mantle, for example, was one. There were others. I haven't kept up on modern scholarship enough to know if they've had any newer insights or if it's still largely up to debate like it was back in the 80s when I was in college the first time. But when we're talking about the Ring of Fire, we're talking about subduction zones along the Pacific Plate. And what a subduction zone is when two plates collide and then one pushes under the other. That's subduction, to go under. So when that happens, especially when you're dealing with an oceanic plate like this, if the oceanic plate, which tends to be more dense, almost always is going to go under a continental plate if those two collide. And it's going to take wet, moist oceanic sediment down with it. It's going to take water down with it. That's going to get into, hotter and hotter depths, and that's going to cause the water to evaporate. You're going to start getting steam pressure. That's why you get these rings of volcanoes along these subduction zones. A lot of that some of it's a melting plate itself. You're melting the rock, But in a lot of the cases, you're also putting a lot of water down there. That's why a lot of the volcanoes along the Ring of Fire tend to be very explosive. Think Pinatubo, think Mount St. Helens over in the Cascades. It's steam pressure building up under there, and it has no way out until it blows. Just like a steam kettle would blow if you don't let the steam out, or a pressure cooker, a boiler. Anything like that. That's what we're talking about here, in simplistic terms anyway. One problem with what he said, though, is not everything along the Pacific Plate is a subduction zone. For example, in California, what you actually have is a transverse fault, where they're going side by side, they're rubbing against each other. That's why you don't see a lot of volcanoes in California. What you get is earthquakes. They're just rubbing past each other. A little something weird is happening up in the Pacific Northwest when you get to places like Washington and Oregon, especially, because there's some remnant of a much older fault up there, bits and pieces that are broken up in chunks, and those are getting shoved under. They're not part of the Pacific Plate, but that's why you have that Cascade Range in that region. Now, when you get up to Alaska, which they mentioned, Alaska is, you've actually got something else entirely going on up there. You're not getting so much subduction as you are collision and an uplift. So, yes, all these earthquakes all along this region are because of plate tectonics, specifically, primarily anyway, the Pacific Plate in these cases. But if we're talking specifically about the Ring of Fire, that's going to only be in areas where one plate or the other is going under the other, subduction zones. And yes, they tend to be heavily volcanic, and they tend to be very explosive.
This geologic history has made the islands mineral rich, but also means the inhabitants must deal with the destructive potential of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions.
Yep.
Of the 7,000 islands, only about 1,000 have human habitation.
That's not accurate. I'm pretty sure that the official tally is closer to 2,000, but I guess it depends on what you consider inhabited, what your cutoff is between inhabited and uninhabited. If there's one person, is it inhabited? What is your standard for inhabited?
And most of those are around 1 square mile in size.
Many of them are very small, yes.
3 island groups: Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao.
Correct.
Mindanao is the southernmost group. The Visayas are the central set, and Luzon is the northernmost, named for the largest island in the group, and in the Philippines as a whole. The island of Luzon is the most populated, and includes the capital of Manila. The earliest trace of Homo sapiens, the modern human, is approximately 47,000 years ago.
Sound about
they
right.
They were preceded by earlier hominids, Homo luzonensis.
I was going to say luzonensis.
For where it was found near Luzon is dated to approximately 134,000 years ago. And there is evidence that places Homo erectus on the islands as far back as 700,000 years ago.
Last I heard, Homo erectus is not certain, but there is some evidence that they were there. But for sure, Homo sapiens, obviously, and Homo luzonensis.
The ancestors of the modern native population had established themselves by around 3000 BCE, having migrated from Taiwan, other nearby islands, and the Asian mainland. They were Austronesian, meaning they belonged to a sociocultural and language group spread across maritime Southeast Asia and reached as far west as Madagascar. Austronesian is the parent language of Malay or Indonesian, Taiwanese, Tagalog, and others spoken throughout islands in the South Pacific. Early settlements in the Philippines tended to stay along rivers and tended to be somewhat isolated by geography.
Yeah, and we talked about this in other videos. In fact, my very first video, we made a big point about this. Early civilizations almost always occur along rivers, or in a few isolated cases, other bodies of fresh water. But that makes perfect sense. Gotta have a fresh drinking source.
Because of this, They did not develop an overarching political connection,
right.
Instead maintaining communities via intermarriage and other kinship relations. Trade between and amongst the islands and the mainland was well established by 2000 BCE, evidenced by Philippine jade artifacts found throughout the local area, produced using techniques common to India in the Philippines. These objects, along with ideas and the people who carried them, traveled via the Maritime Jade Road, a massively extensive trade network that existed for approximately 3,000 years, until 1000 CE. The last 1,500 years of this era appear to be a time of extended peace throughout the Philippine Islands and the nearby area. This is evidenced in part by the trade itself, but it is also supported by a lack of archaeological finds of human bones that
is not indicative of anything. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There is absolutely evidence of war going on in certain regions of the Philippines. These islands they're islands, so they're isolated from each other. It's very possible that some were more aggressive than others, that there was more fighting going on in some areas than others. But saying there's no evidence for bodies or anything like that is kind of meaningless. There's a lot of things that go into the archaeology of determining things like that. It all depends on the type of weapons people would be using, the conditions of preservation. Do bones survive long in the climates and conditions that exist on some of these islands? We have to look at all these things before we really make decisions. Philippines, I know, has a lot of, especially when we're going back this far, we're going to be talking about primarily wooden and bone weapons if they existed at all. Yeah, stonework. There might even be other types of technology available, especially when we get into the 1000 CE period. But it's really hard to definitively say that it was relatively peaceful. Just because we're not finding weapons doesn't mean anything. Just because we're not finding human remains that show signs of battle doesn't necessarily mean anything. There's so many other things to go into it. In paleontology, we call this fossil bias. Certain climates, certain conditions are conducive to preserving soft material, especially bones and tissue. That's why you tend to find fossils associated with wetter environments, for example. You're not going to find them in areas where there's a lot of erosion or in areas where there's a lot of environmental factors that break down material, like jungles, for example. So I guess what I'm getting here is, again, lack of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Absence of evidence, I should say. I do know for a fact there's evidence of conflicts during this that period. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to add there. Not much, but it's really not a safe assumption to make that it was relatively peaceful. It could have been. I'm not saying it wasn't, just saying that the lack of evidence isn't indicative of anything.
Show evidence of a violent death. Such evidence, however, may simply have not yet been found.
Or it may not have survived.
Begins around 900 CE. The earliest document is the Laguna copperplate inscription, which is a record of the forgiveness of a debt. By this time,
as usual, early writing, wherever we find it, tends to have to do with financial matters. That was by everything we've found so far, it seems to be that early writing had a lot to do with economics, of tracking who owes what to whom.
The people of the archipelago had begun to organize themselves into socio-political units, called barangays. These are akin to a city-state, and could be as small as 30 people.
But I just had a thought. That's another thing that's always kind of annoyed me a little bit, is when you hear people talk about writing started in this area at this time. That is based on what we know. but early writing materials may not have been something that preserves well. If you're writing on bark, for example, or anything that's perishable, paper, papyrus, and you're not in a climate like Egypt where the dryness helps preserve it, it's not going to be around. So sometimes when we say, like, this is the earliest known writing, that's fair to say, but it's not fair to assume that writing didn't exist before this or even long before this, written on softer materials that don't preserve.
People, or as large as 500. Some of these came together in confederacies, ruled by a paramount leader chosen from among the rulers of the allied polities, called datus. In areas that had greater contact with the Indian subcontinent, they called the rulers Raja. Later, in areas that had adopted Islam, they were called sultans. Society within these barangays was organized by class, with the highest being the Maginoo, next the freeman, the maharlika, then finally the enslaved, the alipin, all with subcategories to specify a person's status. The early cultures of the Philippines practiced a polytheistic animism, in which all things have a spirit that must be attended in order to maintain good fortune and avoid bad. Ancestor worship was also included in this, with the ancestors sometimes taking on the aspect of animals, and vice versa. Magic and witchcraft were widely believed to have influence, and those who practiced these could be highly respected and or greatly feared.
Right. None of that's really unusual, especially for Asia, but all over the world. Animism is very common, the idea that things have spirits. You see that in many places in the Americas, both of North and South. Ancestor worship you see all over the world in various places, and the belief in magic and witchcraft, both for good and bad. You find that all over. There seems to be kind of a natural evolution of religion. There really does. The older forms, animism is very common. When you get closer to the modern era, you tend to see progressively more of a movement towards really tight pantheons of beings that control everything and or all-powerful singular individuals.
Filipinos were introduced to Buddhism and Hinduism sometime before the 9th century CE. The archaeological record and documents found in China and India show that some Philippine barangays and islands owed tribute to the Srivijaya Empire, a powerful Indonesian Buddhist state that controlled the maritime trade in the area.
There are also Chinese documents that show that China was taking tribute from the Philippines, but I'm not sure exactly what period of time that was.
Between the 6th and 13th centuries. Their influence was followed by that of the Majapahit, a Hindu Buddhist state, centered on the island of Java. Both Buddhism and Hinduism influenced the existing belief systems and culture, and influence was made easier by the language connections that seemed to exist between Philippines and Indian Sanskrit.
Yep.
Islam.
Yeah, some Tagalog dialects do have loan words from Sanskrit, which hints at a connection with India, but that doesn't necessarily mean a direct connection. It is possible that this is coming through intermediaries. So India might be trading with someplace else in Southeast Asia. That country may be trading with another neighbor who is trading with the Philippines. And the languages and culture and religions in this case are flowing back and forth.
First arrived in the Philippines via a missionary, Makdum Karim, in 1380. He accompanied merchants and preached Sunni Islam to people in the Sulu archipelago. He is also credited with building the first mosque in the Philippines. He was followed a decade later by the Indonesian Minangkabau Prince Raja Baguinda, who also set up the Sulu Sultanate. In the early 15th century, the Chinese mariner Zhang founded Chinese Muslim communities in the Philippines. This history of the Philippines is generally organized as pre- and post-colonial. Most of the information we have on the centuries leading up to the Spanish arrival is provided through the chronicles and histories of other countries, notably China.
Right.
Some of these are in passing, or only noted in trade records. Others stand out, and a bit more of their story can be told. The oldest documented barangay is Tondo, a large polity located on the Pasig River Delta in the modern Manila Bay. They were associated with the nearby Manila, which was an independent barangay with whom they shared monopolies on trade across Southeast Asia. This trade was sufficiently important to the Chinese that under the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty, a governor was appointed to oversee it. In fact, most of the documented information we have about the Philippines in the pre-colonial era comes from records of other countries with whom the various barangay interacted. China provides the most extensive of these, but there is corroborating information from Japan, Champa, India, and others. This kingdom had declined by the early 16th century and had been overtaken by the Luzon. The Luzon were the local peoples around Tondo who took the opportunity of the conquest by Brunei to assert themselves. They were a militaristic culture who were involved in wars all over the Philippines, Indonesia, and mainland Asia, sometimes under the auspices of their state and sometimes as individuals and groups acting as mercenaries. Another largely documented state is the Sultanate of Sulu, so called even though the society pre-existed the introduction of Islam and its political terminology. In the 12th and 13th centuries, people from the Visayas area moved into the Sulu archipelago, in the Mindanao section of the Philippine Islands. They established their state and were known to trade throughout the area, including with the people of Champa on the Indonesian peninsula, some of whom moved to Sulu. There was a short war between the Sulu and the Champa in the 12th century, after which trade was normalized again, shortly before they were overtaken by an outside power. In the 13th century, according to Chinese records, the area was under the control of the Bruneian Sultanate, along with Maay and Manila. Little else is said, except that they regained their independence at some later date. They had certainly done so by the early 15th century, when its leader, Raja Baguinda, converted to Islam and was independently ruling the now Sultanate. Sometime before the 11th century, the Rajanate of Butuan emerged on the island of Mindanao. It was a mixed kingdom, with the majority of people practicing Hinduism, but the leadership practicing Buddhism. They were known for their expertise with gold and had extensive trade ties with China, as well as with the various kingdoms of the Indochina Peninsula. There were other major independent polities, of whom less is known. They had separate agreements for trade with surrounding states and different cultural influences from them. The Cabaloan barangay was greatly influenced by China and Japan. Their clothing reflected the styles of both, as did cultural norms like blackened teeth. Other polities like Maray and Palilu were trade partners with China. There is also evidence of conflict between the people of the Visayan section of the archipelago and towns on the Chinese coastline, instigated by the Filipinos.
Interesting, I did not know that.
In the decades prior to European contact, the Bruneian Sultanate again pushed into the Philippines. They started with Tondo and Manila Bay, with the idea of breaking their monopoly on the Chinese trade of certain goods. They were successful, establishing Selarong, also known as the Kingdom of Manila, as a vassal state in 1500. Their leader, Sultan Bolkiah, married into the ruling family of the Sultanate of Sulu, thereby connecting those two powers. The first contact between the people of the Philippines and Europeans was in 1521, when the Spanish expedition to circumnavigate the globe, led by the Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, stopped there.
Yep.
They anchored off Suluan Island, in the central part of the archipelago on the 14th of March.
Didn't go well for Magellan either. It definitely didn't.
Magellan planted the Spanish flag, calling the islands the Islas de San Lázaro. The next day, they landed at nearby Hamanhan Island, where Magellan met with the leaders of the Cebu and Limasawa peoples. Their leader, the Raja Humaban, spoke at length with Magellan, and then decided to convert to Catholicism. Spanish priests in the expedition baptized him, his wife, and many of their household. In the tradition of taking a new or additional name at one's baptism, the Raja became Carlos, in honor of King Charles I of Spain. His wife took the name Juana, in honor of the king's mother. Joanna, daughter of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. The Raja then ordered the people of the nearby islands to welcome Magellan and his men, provide them with supplies, and convert to Catholicism. His level of influence is shown by the fact most of these people followed his lead into the church. However, Datu Lapu-Lapu, one of the chiefs on the island of Mactan, refused. Very little is known about him prior to these events, except that he was Humabon's rival for influence in the area. He rejected the idea of conversion and also prevented his neighboring leader, Datu Zula, from sending gifts to Magellan. This prompted Humabon and Zula to suggest that Magellan force the issue with a personal visit, which Magellan saw as an opportunity to both show strength to and a willingness to work in an alliance with the local peoples. On the
Didn't work out well for him.
1521, Magellan and his force landed on Mactan and were immediately barraged with spears, rocks, and arrows. This initial attack was more demoralizing than deadly to the Spanish. Offshore, the Spanish saw this attack and shot with both muskets and crossbows, but were too far away to have an effect. Magellan's next move was to push toward the native village and set fire to some of the houses. This gave even more force behind the Mactan defense. Magellan was immobilized by a poisoned arrow to the leg, and many of his people were quickly killed. By the account of his chronicler Antonio Pigafetta, they focused on Magellan himself, which allowed a few of the Spanish to escape. Lapu-Lapu also made a point of killing all of the natives who aided the Spanish in their attack. This did not include Raja Humabon and Datu Zula. Despite their promise to fight alongside the Spanish, they stayed away. The Raja did try to ransom the body of the Portuguese navigator, but Lapu-Lapu refused any of his offers. Seeing the attitudes of his fellows, Humabon seems to have repudiated his conversion, going as far as to kill some of the Spanish soldiers who escaped the battle. The expedition continued on its way, returning to Spain the next year, having finished the first circumnavigation of the Earth. It was 4 decades before the Spanish or Portuguese again tried to take any Philippine territory.
All right. That was interesting. I wish I could have contributed more. I think I contributed more to the geology than I did to the history. But this is something I've read about, but I don't really know a lot about. So I am happy to have had a chance to see this. I hope you guys learned something. This is one of those countries that I think a lot of us really don't know enough about. It's a very, as you can see here, very multi-ethnic, very varied. There are so many languages present in the Philippines. Most people think of Tagalog or Taglish as being the dominant language, which it is in the heavily settled areas like Manila. But there are so many other cultures and religions and languages all over the place in these islands. And that's not really surprising given the nature of the islands and given the many influences that have been around here. Because as they pointed out, you've got the Chinese coming in, you've got the Muslims coming in, you've got Hindus coming in, Buddhists coming in. It's quite the melting pot, which I think kind of separates it from some of the other regions of Asia, especially at this early period. And then, of course, you get Magellan introducing it to Portugal and Spain. You're going to get the Spanish period in the Philippines, and you're going to get the American period in the Philippines. That poor country has been under just about everybody's thumb at one point or the other. The Japanese are going to take it in World War II and hold on to it for a bit. So, an interesting place, and it's something I'd like to know more about, and I hope some of you do too. So, we'll probably pick up with the next part, not the history of the Philippines after independence, but the history of the Philippines after colonization, I think is the next one. But we'll not do that right away. We'll do it a little way down the road. I do, like I said, want to get to a video on the Philippine-American War. That's why I'm wanting to look at these first. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, bye-bye.